Welcome back to another installation of Salvation Army Trivia and History. Last week I talked about the time when there were four Salvation Armies running around, and then how that kind of settled down. But it all kind of got stirred up again in 1896. In 1896, there were a couple of things that happened. One was the establishment of the Volunteers of America, which I'll talk about next week. But the other one was the reinstitution of the American Salvation Army. So you had the Salvation Army, of course, International Salvation Army that we're all part of. But there was a guy by the name of James Duffin who brought together some people who had been part of the previous American Salvation Army. Now, it's a little cloudy what happened in the 1890s. It may be that there were some individual American Salvation Army Corps that continued to operate as independent entities. We really don't know. It's very difficult to discover that because of the records and so on. And if anything, they operate kind of sort of like the independent Baptist churches might. They weren't a tie to any organization. But Duffin saw the opportunity when the Army was weakened by the establishment of the Volunteers of America to maybe resurrect the American Salvation Army. And so he brought together some folks, and they incorporated themselves in 1896, I believe it was in Philadelphia, and they called themselves, again, the American Salvation Army. Now, similar to the Salvation Army, they had a war cry, they had dark uniforms, bonnets, they had, the flag was exactly the same. It was very confusing as to who was what. Now, they grew, again, quite rapidly. It seems like Duffin was a fairly good administrator, a good leader. But it was more and more of an irritation to the International Salvation Army. In fact, it was a problem because people would want to donate to the International Salvation Army. They would see the American Salvation Army, the donation would go to them. And there was competition between the two Salvation Armies. It was not uncommon for one Salvation Army to have an open air on one street corner, and right across on the other side, there's the American Salvation Army doing an open air on their side. So there was some tension between the two. Officers and soldiers who were disgruntled would go from one to the other, and so it was really a bit of a problem. And so Evangeline Booth, who then was the national commander, decided she would do something about it, and she actually began a lawsuit against the American Salvation Army for copyright infringement. Now, copyright infringement in these days was very, very difficult to have enforced, simply because it was very common for people to write a song, someone else to take it, use it. The Salvation Army did that a lot of it with the tunes that we used in the early days. We would take tunes of popular songs and we'd reuse them. That was very common in those days. But as time went by, people were starting to say, no, we have a right to our intellectual property. And that was essentially what Evangeline Booth was saying. The International Salvation Army established our flag, our war cry. We established our uniforms, we established our reputation, and therefore those things need to be guarded. Well, the courts eventually found in favor of the International Salvation Army in a suit called the Salvation Army versus the American Salvation Army. In 1910, this was a very sweeping decision by the courts. They said that the American Salvation Army could not use the term salvation, army, they could not have dark uniforms, they could not have bonnets, they could not have a flag like ours, they could not call their magazine the war cry. It was very, very comprehensive. And so the American Salvation Army changed their name to the American Rescue Workers. And they kept the terms corps and soldiers and officers. They kept those terms for their membership, if you will. But they could not use any of our other terms. And they continued on. In fact, they're still around today, but they're almost extinct. And that separated the two organizations. And in fact, the legislation, or excuse me, the decision by the courts to with the American Salvation Army, the Salvation Army versus the American Salvation Army Act, our decision, is still a landmark copyright decision and still is cited today in copyright decisions. And so it's interesting. We didn't tend to make legislative history or judicial history, but we did because of this American Salvation Army. So they say imitation is the greatest form of flattery. It also can get you sued. So you have to be very careful about those kinds of things. Next week, I'll talk to you about the Volunteers of America, how they got started, and where we became more and more separated from them. Thank you for joining me today. God bless you.